It ultimately brings me to the next thing that I want to ask. You know, you were talking about witches, and on your website you had that story of the witch who's killed in New Guinea, wasn't it? As recently as 2013, right? And that breaks my heart, right? My whole heart. And it emphasizes for me why speaking out against science denial, even though people say why platform them, things like that. I get it. But why speaking out against is important. Why, for me, going into an echo chamber on Facebook, it's a Facebook comment, but whatever, at least I'm a voice, right? Why going in there and breaking that echo chamber up is important. Because if I can have one person see what I had to say and not subscribe to that thing, right, think critically about what they believe and come out of it a better person, it's worth it to me. No matter how much ridicule I get, it doesn't matter, it rolls off me, it's fine. You can't say anything worse about me than I've already said about myself, so like whatever, okay? I would just 8 Mile you all day. Fine. That's a really fringe reference.
Eminem?
Yeah, Eminem in the 8 Mile, where he goes through the rap battle and he just dogs himself the whole time, and then it's like, now say something I haven't already said, bam, and he drops the mic and he wins. Yeah, I'll just 8 Mile myself all day. You can't do anything to me. But do you think it's important to do that, to do those sorts of things, to go in and break that up, to speak out against it? Do you think it's helpful? You know, anything like that? Like, what is your take on, for example, going a modern day debate, to debate a flat earther or creationist or an anti-vaxxer, a transphobic person, anything like that? What do you think is the benefit of doing that, if any? Let me know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm gonna have to say if I have an overall answer is I'm undecided. However, some caveats.
Yeah.
So my site for example, on my site, I joke that my audience is the normals. Right. So you've got like a bell curve. Yeah, you've got people over here who don't need me, people over here that I'm just not going to convince. So I'm after the middle. I do comment with people who are over here, and it's not people, right? It is every single issue has a different spectrum of bell curve for the same person. But in any particular case, there are some that I just don't think are worth interacting with. Mm-hmm. Part of that might be because of the limitations of something like Facebook or my own time. I think if it was a one-on-one conversation with someone in particular that I had like a relationship with, that might be different. I think so there's that. Moving a little bit further, there are people that I feel like I could interact with, and the value wouldn't necessarily be to them, but would be to other people watching. So for every person that comments, there's probably, and I don't have the data for this, but there's probably a lot more people who see it. And so the kinds of back and forth exchanges that might help them understand something better. Moving a bit further, there are people who I feel like might be on the right side, but that could benefit from a better understanding of how to argue well. And when I say how to argue well, I mean even basic things like not name calling or calling someone stupid. Just like here is how dispassionate discourse I teach my students that argumentation is not a battle to win. The goal isn't to win, the goal is to get it right. So that if you let go the need to be right, then the other person you're with, your interlocutor, could the two of you together can work together to try to get to a better understanding than you would have had at your own. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a bit of a spectrum. As far as someone who's like an absolute denier, like we've referenced the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate. Man, before you said that actually changed your mind, I had a different view. And so I'm glad you said that. Like I see people debating evolution, debating climate change, debating vaccines. And oftentimes what it looks like to a lot of us who try to communicate science is a strongly supported science position with someone who does not deserve to be platformed and does not have an equal standing, but that may, depending on their rhetorical and argumentative skills, appear to win an argument whilst not actually having the better evidence on their side. And so my question has always been, how many people those actually serve to convince? Mm-hmm. And so you saying that actually it does provide a different perspective for me. So I appreciate that. Because scientifically speaking, like when we talk about evolution, there is no side by side.
There's not. No, it's an established. Essentially, if I know science doesn't prove things, right? It's wrong to say that science proves things when we say when we instead we say strongly supported by the evidence. But evolution is an established theory for a reason, is well supported by the evidence, right? To the extent that it's fact, basically. Like, there's no question about it anymore. The jury's not out on this one. Evolution has gone up against creationism, I think, in legal trials 4 or 5 times now, and gets shut down every time to try to get taught in schools. Every time it loses, no matter what.
So this is one of the reasons when I teach, this might be a bit of a tangent here, but when I teach my course on critical thinking and science literacy, I focus on falsifiability because a lot of these issues can be addressed right away with, can we actually prove this wrong? So something like evolution, in the olden days, I'm old enough to remember, in the olden days, it was just God did magic, right? And then it went through some trials and then moved forward, and it became creation science.
Creation science evangelism. That's what I grew up in. Yep.
Yeah, and then it moved a bit, and now then it became intelligent design, right? And so with my students, and to be fair, I teach in Massachusetts, and it's a relatively liberal state. So I don't tend to have students who deny evolution or who deny climate change or so on. I do every once in a while, but they have their own different kinds of beliefs, especially pseudoscientific beliefs. But the first question when you're asking yourself is something true is, can I prove this wrong? And if you're talking about something that can't be proven wrong, it doesn't mean that it's not wrong, right? It just means that it's not evidence-based. And that you need to be honest with yourself. So something like intelligent design, okay, can we test for an intelligent designer? No, we can't.
Because you're gonna, one of two things is gonna happen. All creationists say the same one of two things, or right. Most do. Either every evidence of evolution is evidence of intelligent design, no matter how many intermediate fossils you find, that doesn't show common ancestry, it shows common designer. Heard that one a million times. Or a miracle happened. How do all the animals get off of Noah's boat into the places they exist in geographically if it lands on Mount Ararat? How did the kangaroos hop from Noah's Ark to Australia and didn't leave any kangaroo bones behind on the way there? God guided them there because that's where they're supposed to be. And as soon as you appeal to miracle, the discussion's over, right? We're no longer having a science conversation at all.
I can't test that. Right. So, do you know Stephen Jay Gould?
Go ahead. Tell us about it.
So Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionary biologist, and he died. I lose track of time. 10, 15 years ago, but and he was an excellent writer. And had regular columns for a few places that are definitely worth looking into. And he has great popular science books. But he made popular this concept that he called NOMA, which is non-overlapping magisteria. Okay, so the idea is that religion is here, science is here. It's like a Venn diagram that does not overlap. Each one of them have different ways of looking at the world. But neither one should trespass on the other. So actually, he was kind of also going after some of the New Age atheists, the Four Horsemen, kind of the idea that God, science could disprove God.
Right, which it doesn't do. God's an unfalsifiable concept, right?
Right. Science cannot demonstrate a God, nor can it disprove a God.
Right.
And so that's where he would say non-overlapping magisteria. And I personally prefer that framework when I'm talking to my students. But even backing up to the kind of claim that's being made, can I even test that? And it's important for me to know, if I'm considering a claim, that that's not one that evidence could ever disprove. So in my own brain, I can put it in its own little classification system that goes, this is not an evidence-based claim. I am choosing to believe this for various other reasons.
Right. What I say is because I take that line from your article too. Just because something's unfalsifiable does not mean it's false. And because I have a lot of religious students who are a lot of homeschool kids, and so of course they're homeschooled because they're very religious. And when we do critical thinking, I have to make sure I couch this in. I'm not trying to tell you to not believe in God, okay? Because I'll lose them immediately. I know that, and I always upfront with just full disclosure. I don't, but I'm not going to tell you not to. And I can't demonstrate that it's not true. And I want to start with this concept of unfalsifiability. Just because a claim is unfalsifiable doesn't mean it's not true. But what I will say is that it's not informative. Because I'm sorry?
Does that land?
Usually I do okay with that. They'll go, interesting. So I'll say it's not that it's not true. It's not that that you're wrong for believing. You can choose to believe what you want, but it doesn't inform our society well. It doesn't inform us well to make good decisions based on that, because there's no metric by which to measure whether it's a good idea or not. If you want to base your beliefs on any mythology, you can do that. That's fine. Mythology is important to human culture for a reason. It's how we pass morality down, right? And for me, that's what religion is. It's a mythology that's used to pass moralities down. I just think in the case of, for example, the Old Testament, it's far too old. It's unrelevant anymore. And so, believe it if you want, take from it the parts that you want to take. Leave from it the parts that are not helpful, or because it's not informative. Take the ideas and decide if the ideas are informative. But the faith itself doesn't inform you anymore, because you can't actually hold it up to a standard. I can't hold up purity culture, for example, which I loathe. Mm-hmm. Way to ostracize tons of women by telling them their entire value is objective.
There's a reason I left the church.
Yeah. Purity culture is disgusting. And part of the reason that it is because it tries to take this unfalsifiable claim of your value is based on like the number of partners you have, or the amount of men you make sin, or whatever. In my school, we use the chewing gum analogy. We use the plate of cookies analogy. And because I was very progressive, I changed this. To a pie analogy. I said, well, hang on. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm still a whole person. It's more like when I share, I'm sharing part of myself. I have one partner, I've cut the pie in half. I have multiple partners, I've cut the pie in thirds or fourths. But then they've given me a piece of their pie. So then my pie just becomes this amalgamation of all of the people I've loved. And so I very much reworked that entire analogy into a very different thing than what purity culture says to be. But my point is, we find you can look at take God out of purity culture. Take the religion out of it. Look at the tenets and the beliefs and the claims that it makes, and ask yourself: are they effective? Do they cause harm, or do they cause well-being? And across the board, it causes harm. Low self-esteem. You have relationships collapsing. You have marriages nobody wants to be in. You have skyrocketing divorce rate. Everyone likes to cite the 50% divorce rate, and they don't understand that divorce rate number comes right after divorces were legal and okay for most women to do. And so loads of women got divorced because of course they did. They were in miserable fucking marriages. What are you talking about? And you wouldn't let them get divorced before that. So of course an of them did. And then now it's dive down. It's down. Now that things have stabilized, there's less divorce because people are getting married when they want to. It makes sense. Duh. Pay attention. Anyway,
the most sense to me is that women initiate 70% of divorces.
Yeah.
Dudes, hey, if you just listen to the women in your life. Just listen to them. Yeah, it's really not.
It's not hard.
No, I'm totally with you. When I teach this, I'm always trying. My goal is okay. Let me back up, because I also like to use humor a lot, and I like to use concepts that are not triggering. In that, so I'm gonna badly paraphrase Carl Sagan here, but he said something to the effect of if we teach people only the findings of science, and not how we learn the findings, then how is anyone to understand the difference between science and pseudoscience? So in class, I use a lot of pseudoscience. In a science class, what I'm trying to do is get them to understand why science is reliable and how to find good scientific evidence to make good conclusions, to make reliable conclusions. But to do that, I use a lot of pseudoscience so they understand the difference.
Nice.
So with pseudoscience, though, so I mean that's why I start with like witches, or I actually start with a personality, like an astrology reading.
And I really like that in your articles that you always begin with a very personal story so that it grounds us in this is a person who believes something wrong and this is the consequence of that, so that we understand right away this is going to be impactful. My students in particular are really receptive to the woman who gets burned for being a witch in New Guinea. Because I don't tell them it's 2013 until the end of that story. I make them guess, and they always guess like 1700s, and I go 2013, and they're like, no, and I'm like, yes. Now most of the time I can't show them the image you have on there of like the torture devices stuff, right? I gotta send, and I always tell them I'm censoring for content, not for argument, right? You're gonna get the whole argument from me. I'm not gonna cherry pick the argument. I'm not gonna pat it down to make it nice for you. Okay, I'm going to tell you what happened, but just know that I'm not going to show it to you graphically, or I'm going to cut some words. Like you have the one about the woman who's sexually assaulted in her apartment, and then picks her assaulter out of the lineup, and she's wrong, and the guy goes to prison for the wrong. Well, I can't say that's a sexual, so I say attacked, right? Like I censor it a little bit, but I make sure the argument is always presented, and having that really personal story, starting with this is a very reasonable sounding thing that a person really did, grounds for the audience. I really appreciate that you do that. Have the personal story at the beginning of each article is very, very helpful in demonstrating the point, like you just said, beginning with the pseudoscience, so we can see the difference. Had this person thought rationally, that man wouldn't have gone to jail unjustly. Had this person thought rationally, that woman wouldn't have been killed for a superstitious nonsense belief. Had we thought rationally, what was his name? Tom Green wouldn't have had, 2 members of his family die from COVID. That didn't have to. Things like that are super important. So I super agree, and I just want to say thank you very much.
You saying that because I've, in my attempt to communicate to the normals, what I'm trying to do is tell stories and to explain the concepts. Did you happen to read the one? Because I want to come back to that for a second. But did you happen to read the one? It's my favorite about the incompetence. Oh, what was the guy's name?
Oh, the guy who paints his face with the lemon juice or whatever, and then he robs the bank, and he thinks he's gonna make him invisible. That's my favorite. So
yeah, funny. That's my favorite too. That's why I bring that.
It's so funny. Holy so good. And he just what do they pull him out, and he just says, "But the juice."
But I wore the juice.
I wore the juice.
I wore the juice.
It's so good. And ultimately, like from a purely, it's funny because it's effective from a rhetorical standpoint, although from a purely evidence standpoint, it's anecdotal, right? So we understand that it's anecdotal and that it's kind of a but that's why anecdotal evidence, I feel, goes in a hierarchy. I don't feel like it's worthless. I feel like it goes in a hierarchy. Anecdotal evidence is fine until I have a controlled study that refutes you. And then your anecdotal evidence doesn't mean anything, except in that one case where I'm very sorry that happened. But it is, when paired with the actual argument and the actual evidence, it grounds it. And it is rhetorically very effective.
Okay. Okay. Interestingly, when I cover this with my students, so I'm going to come back to falsifiability in a second.
Yes.
But anecdotal evidence, I find when teaching critical thinking that one of the biggest barriers is this. It is the assumption that because I saw it, because I felt it, because it happened to me, that it's
true.
Evidence. Right. And so I actually so I start with witches, and then I go on to the limits of perception and memory, and we talk about like all of the ways that your personal experiences can fool. There's a great Richard Feynman quote, something like the first principle is that you must not fool yourself,
and you are the easiest person to fool. I love that.
We actually use ghosts and UFOs to talk about this, because it's like, I know ghosts are real because I saw one, or I know UFOs are real or I know homeopathy works because I tried it, right? Whatever it is, it's this personal experience.
That's my mom, homeopathics. Yeah.
Please don't get me started on that. So, you don't want that.
The amount of times that I had a toothache and my mom rubbed tea tree oil on my teeth instead of giving me ibuprofen. Yeah.
You're so close to getting me started.
Next time. I'll tell you all about it next time, Melanie.
I find now that if I'm going to teach science, then I have to first give students, really convince them of why we need science in the first place. And we need science in the first place because we're biased and emotional and tribal, and we're prone to jumping to conclusions based on illusory patterns and illusory correlations and coming to wrong conclusions, but being absolutely overconfident that we're right. And so we need to first understand why we might be misled to understand why we need science. So again, after my witchcraft lecture and trying to get students just to rethink, like, what do you think you know and why? Moving into, okay, a lot of what you think you know is based on what you've experienced or what others have told you that they've experienced, in which case they're really prone to some basic errors. And we can talk about that more if you like, but before we close the loop on falsifiability, I just have to. So, Pythagoras, like Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah, teach it all the time.
So, falsifiability is a really hard concept, right? It is a difficult concept for most people to get. And I can say this because my mom's not here. I tend to throw I use my mom as my example a lot. I love her to death. She's absolutely wonderful. She has a stupid sense of humor that I really appreciate, as we've already established. She just like most people, critical thinking is hard work. And so why would you need to even do it? You've been thinking your whole life, right? Why would you need to do something?
To just come naturally.
Right. She listens to the extent to which she loves me and she hears me talk. Although she's still kind of astounded that people actually want to hear me talk.
Of course we do. You have an informed opinion. What are you talking about? Yeah.
Okay, so back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras was obviously a really smart dude, but he was part of this group at the time that was trying to establish like a mathematical pattern behind everything.
Right.
They were pretty successful. Nevertheless, they had some interesting beliefs. Like, for example, Pythagoras thought that when you farted, your soul was leaving your body. Okay. So he was so afraid of farting that he wouldn't eat beans. Okay. Right.
No.
So here I am trying to teach my students on falsifiability. And so I say this to my mom, right? And my mom's like, you can see the wheels. Dogs fart. Do dogs have souls? That's a really good question, Mom. What do you think? Well, I've farted a lot. Is my soul gone? How would I know if my soul was gone? Like, legit, you can see all this going on, right? So I use this with my students now because it's so flippant amazing. It's funny. Who in the world is offended by the idea of farts and souls, right? And yet I will say that modern Reiki people will say that farting during a Reiki session is cleansing your sacral aura.
It's crazy.
Sacral chakra.
That's an insane way to justify a very uncomfortable thing that happens. Wow.
Right. So I'm like, okay, let's talk about, well, what is a soul? Well, that's a good question. How would you measure a soul? I don't know. All these things come up naturally. So when I bring these concepts up to my students, like falsifiability, if I just jumped in with God and evolution or something,
you lose them.
Trigger some students. But if I go in with farting and souls, then all of a sudden students can come to these questions on their own, right? They're not triggered. They think it's funny.
Yeah.
It automatically leads into, can I measure a soul? What is a soul? Right? Yes, brilliant. Which is why I start with falsifiability. It is so hard to understand. But if you start there and start to ask yourself, can I prove this wrong? Because if I can't, then I need to put it over here.
Right.
I need to leave it separate and not try to make it evidence-based, and know that a lot of our core beliefs, the things that we really hold tightly to who we are unfalsifiable beliefs. And what we've done is we've constructed fact shields around them. We've used things that are falsifiable. We've used factual evidence to try and build justifications for these unfalsifiable things that we really want to believe. So if I circle back to science denial here, a lot of that is not motivated by well, let me take out the negatives. It's motivated by wanting to believe something that's congruent with various emotional beliefs, or with various solutions that I want to believe in. If I, in my own brain, have the ability to sort out, this is basic metacognition, right? To sort out where my beliefs come from. What kinds of beliefs are they? Are they ones that can be proven false or not? If they can't be, then I need to separate them and understand why I believe them, why I might want to believe them. If they are falsifiable, are they consistent with the current evidence? Am I being honest with myself with how I evaluate them? Right. And so basic first step is really difficult to get to. And all that was just an excuse to talk about Pythagoras and farts.
That's fantastic. I love it. In fact, this is phenomenal. So do you know the etymology of the word spirit? Do you know?
No.
The Greek word spear means wind or breath.
Yeah.
So, in many ancient cultures, what happens? A god breathes the breath of life into people. And so I am absolutely not an ancient culture expert, but from what I have gathered from the ones I have watched, it is very plausibly the case that spirit or soul comes from the idea that we know we're alive when we breathe, and we know when we die we don't breathe, which means life has to be tied to the breath, and that's the spirit. Wind is the spirit of the gods, or god or gods affecting the world around you. That's why trees shake in the wind, they breathe. And that's where you get that animism, that idea that everything is alive because everything breathes, and that must be the spirit. Because ancient people didn't know what the wind was. They didn't know that it was oxygen and carbon dioxide, nitrogen gases and things, right? So they know that when you are born, the first thing you do is breathe in, and then you cry. So when you're born, you're like, ah, right? And that's the first thing. And that's why for a lot of ancient people, especially in and this is true, I believe, in the Old Testament as well, that that they ascribe like personhood at first breath. It's when you first breathe that you are alive. Very plausibly, which I think is super spiritual.
Actually, like a breath.
What is?
Like wind and breeze?
Is the spirit. Is spirit. Yeah. It's like the spirit of gods, or the spirit of the pantheistic all, or whatever ancient culture, ascribed to. They had different takes on it. But that's why when God makes Adam, what does he do? He makes him out of dust, and then he breathes the breath of life into him. He breathes into him because the life is in the breath. And when you die, the last thing you do is breathe out, and it's very plausible that ancient people believed that was the spirit leaving the body, was the last exhalation. And that would make sense if Pythagoras believes that wind passing out of his posterior is his life force leaving him.
You say that way more nicely than I would have. I can hear my mom saying, pull my finger, and then Shep the dog.
I'm dead. That's awesome. That's super cool. That's awesome, Melanie. So ultimately, what did we decide on breaking up echo chambers? We talked about how it is about evaluating our own beliefs, and we talked about how it is about the audience, right? It's not the person you're arguing with. That person probably has their head in the sand about what they believe, not necessarily nefariously, but because it's more important for them to believe a certain thing. And we should be very aware of what's falsifiable or unfalsifiable, right? And that's a really good first litmus, and that's why it's letter F in the floater. Very first thing, right? Is it falsifiable? You can knock out a lot of things this way. Because as I believe, they may be true. They're just not informative. They don't inform us anymore. And it may not be a good idea to make decisions based on those things. You should look at things that we can actually observe here in reality, as opposed to, insane philosophical claims. It's super interesting that you brought that up, because in the last debate I just watched Witz and Nathan do about creationism, their entire thesis for their debate was that evolution is also a philosophy and therefore on par with creation and is not scientifically factual because it's not directly observed. So all they did was admit that their position is entirely unfalsifiable and then just try to put evolution in the same camp. Super interesting to me.
Yeah, can I stop? Because you also said something earlier, which is, and I don't remember under what context you said it, but it was about how somebody didn't believe something because they weren't there.
Yes. So a very common, Ken Ham says this in his debate with Bill Nye, and it's very common among creationist and evolutionist debaters. All over the internet, you'll hear them say there's a difference between observational science, which is things we can observe and study and measure and test, right? If I can do it in a repeatable experiment in a lab and has a dependent and an independent variable, it's science. And if it's not, then it's not, which is baloney, right? You can find university definitions of science that don't subscribe necessarily to that. Observations count too. And you can make novel testable predictions. A much better metric is, does it produce novel testable predictions? Can you predict things we didn't know, see them happen, and go, aha, see, I didn't know that would happen. I thought it would based on this other thing that I know, and that's good evidence, right? Which evolution does all the time and creationism never does. Globe Earth does all the time, flat Earth never does, right? No novel testable predictions. You can't predict anything we didn't know before. But that's what they'll do. Creationist argument is very much, even into today, well, you didn't see these animals turn into other animals. What do we see? I see that dogs make dogs. I see that cats make cats. I see that tomato plants make tomato plants. You might get bigger and smaller tomato plants, but there are limits to the genetic code always degrades. It never gains new information. Hang in there. Those species already had all of the information necessary to look like that in their body. It's like, duplication events happen, right? And rewriting events, like genes can just copy themselves. They can rewrite themselves. You can take the word sad and through duplication and rewriting events make it say the sad cat sat, right? Like, is an example I've seen. Erica, who does a channel called Gutsy Gibbon, she also has one of the best debates against Ken Hovind ever. It's absolutely floored. It's fantastic.
I that one too, by the way.
Yeah, so good. Gutsy Gibbon is awesome. But anyway, so she describes this on her channel, to describe the way that genes can create new information. But a lot of these, creators who bring this argument up are like computer programmers. They'll be like, well, a computer program is blah, blah, blah complexity and has all of these letters, and, DNA is infinitely complex, but it's always losing code. Could you take a computer program for Microsoft Word and randomly change the code and create Microsoft PowerPoint? Yes, actually, given enough random changes to the code, you could. But that's not quite how it works. That's still a straw man argument. That's not what I'm saying happens. But so that's the argument. We see dogs make dogs. I can see cats make cats. You want me to believe that a fish turned into a dog. And that's the pervasive argument.
Yeah. Okay. God, there was a lot in there. I still come back to, so in the floater toolkit, the O stands for objectivity, which is the easiest rule to skip by in floater and the hardest rule to actually adhere to. So it's basically, are you being honest with yourself? And most science denial is motivated by a desire to believe or to not believe.
Right.
And so the question is, are we being honest with ourselves? Back to some of the things you were saying there. These arguments can get really in depth with what appears to be complex arguments that are motivated by their elephants feeding their riders, right? And so superficially, it can appear to feel like facts and even relatively sophisticated facts. I would again come back to, and as someone who, like, my background is biology, and like probably evolution, and then next climate change would be the fields that I would be most comfortable in engaging with someone who denies the science of those. If somebody was really motivated to deny those, I probably wouldn't be able to address all of their concerns. In that, if they've gotten really good at finding nitpicky evidence for things, then understanding the science is not really the point. So what I would get back to is so we've got this you weren't there kind of
you
thing.
weren't there. Yeah, it's not observational science. So you can believe it as a philosophy. What they do is they claim that those unobserved phenomena in evolution are unfalsifiable claims. You weren't there. You don't know that. So we're going to throw that into the realm of philosophy, and it doesn't belong in science class in school. It belongs in philosophy.
So what I would say is all of this evidence that you think is either acceptable or not acceptable because of that underlying premise. Let's address that underlying premise. Okay, you weren't there. If I might back up to the course that I teach, in my mind, has been set up to take students through the most logical progression through an understanding of these concepts. On day 2, I lecture over witches. On day 1, I give them personality assessments, which again, we can talk about if you want to. But I do this game with them. It's a game. So the NCSE has this wonderful, I'm pretty sure it's them, has this wonderful lab. It's called the Checks Lab. Basic premise. Let me back up. So you are in my class. I've got my students here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you with a group of students. You have been assigned the task of understanding the family in a house that moved out before you got there. So you just bought an old house and the family was there for a really long time. You don't know anything about them except as you were moving into the house, you found a series of checks that they had written that were just in various crevices throughout the house. So you have an envelope that contains a total of 16 checks. You were allowed 4. So I want you to randomly pick 4. And I want you to tell me, based on the evidence of those checks, what can you learn about that family? Okay, so students go through the process. I let them have 4 more, and then I let them have 4 more. So you have a total of 12. At the end of that, they get with another group. What's really interesting is that it's not just the evidence that matters, it's how they interpret the evidence. So, for example, some of the checks are written to an OBGYN.
Oh.
Some male students have no idea what that is. Right? I have some checks written to Circuit City. I have no idea what the fuck.
Radio Shack. You got some Radio Shacks in there?
Yes. There's some checks to
Blockbuster Video.
Right. I think it might be to a mortuary.
Okay.
And some of the students have no idea what that is. I have students who, so over the period of time, if you notice, one of there starts to be a junior. And so if students don't understand how when a guy has a boy who names them after themselves, they start going by senior and may give the junior a different, like if it's William, they go by Bill or something. So the diversity of the students who are interpreting the checks helps. It matters in terms of their ability to understand and make sense of them. The whole point is at the end, they have what it seems to be a story about this family. And then they get with another group, and the other group explains to them the evidence that they found, the conclusions they drew from the evidence that was available. This is a long-winded way of saying one of the major misconceptions that people have about science, especially when it comes to an area of science they want to deny, is that somebody has to be there to see it. So in something like this, students get to understand this is historical science. It is, I'm finding evidence. I am interpreting the evidence based on my assumptions. I am allowing that to be filtered through others as well. I am then submitting my interpretations and their interpretations to an overall sense of peer review to try to come to, here's the evidence we have. What is the most reliable conclusion we can draw based on that evidence? And all that happens without anybody being able to see it. So we get to go through this whole process. It's not evolution.
Right. Nothing triggering. Fine.
And so, okay, imagine now that there was a crime, right? So let's say that John was killed, and actually, I have this analogy in class. This is really fun. So let's say that John was killed. We find John dead, and John was killed by a knife. Okay, you're on the jury. Who killed John? Okay. First piece of evidence is that we have Bob, and we know that a couple days before John was killed, they were seen arguing with each other.
That makes Bob a suspect.
Right. Would you convict Bob based on this evidence?
On that evidence alone, no.
Okay. Let's say that on the day that John was killed, that there is a security footage from John's house that Bob entered the house.
Would I convict him on that? Maybe if the time in the video matches the time of death.
Okay, so let's say that the time of the video does, and that we find Bob's fingerprints on the murder weapon.
Ooh. So this is tough for me because on the one hand, that seems really compelling. On the other hand, I'm imagining an insane hypothetical scenario where the actual killer is in there, takes that weapon, threatens Bob, makes him touch it, and then makes him stab the guy, and then runs him out under pain of death because he has another weapon. So I'm like considering this alternative explanation, which you've said in your articles is a very healthy thing to do.
Well, and at this point, students are like, yeah, Bob did it.
Right.
Okay, here's what I want you to do. You have been hired to be Bob's lawyer. What would you argue? Right? What would I argue? Something like what you just argued. Or Bob came over to John's house to apologize and was helping Bob cut the celebration cake, and then somebody else broke in and then used the knife to stab John, right?
Yep.
Right. So they can come up with reasons. The point is, we don't. Could you be wrong? Sure. Okay. But you're back on the jury. Would you convict Bob?
Probably. Probably. Yeah. If everybody else is like, I'd probably like, it's hard. Do we have any evidence that there was somebody else? Anyone else's footprints were in the house? No. Yeah, nothing else. I'd probably like, I don't know, man. We don't have any acquittable evidence. I would need some. Yeah. Oh, it's rough. That's rough. But yeah.
Just if you're Bob's lawyer and you went in and said, well, nobody was there to see it.
That can hold up.
That's not going to hold up.
Yeah.
Or let's add another layer, which is that the leading cause of wrongful convictions is eyewitness testimony.
Yes.
So now let's explore all the ways in which your perception can fool you, right? So by the time we get done with that, students start to understand that, one, just because I saw it doesn't mean that it's true.
Right.
And two, we can figure out what might have happened, even if no one was there to see it.
Yeah.
But all of those are really important underlying concepts between critical thinking and science literacy that I think are often overlooked. And then become fallback excuses for people who want to deny key conclusions of science. Like, for example, well, nobody was there millions of years ago, so how can we possibly know? Well, okay, just because you saw it, does that mean it's true?
Yeah.
Or imagine a crime scene investigator showing up at the scene of a crime saying, oh, hey, there was no eyewitnesses. We'll never know.
It's super interesting because Bill Nye opens his debate with, what are you guys going to do when you go home today? You're going to go home and watch CSI, a show that is all about a bunch of investigators who were not there at the scene of a crime and didn't see it and have to figure out who the killer is anyway. So when my opponent, and he pre-rebuts this argument, and yeah, it's so good, right? He brings that up and he goes, so when my opponent says you weren't there, know that's, and then Ken Ham said it anyway because that's all he had. And that was another one of those moments where I was like, oh, that's a slam. That's really good. He needs to rebut that. He needs to say that there's a reason, and then didn't. And I was like, ooh.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Bill Nye has that in his opener, and it's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal example. Mm-hmm. I always like to, when people say like, well, you can't show me evolution happened in real time, I was like, so we can. I can. It's just a micro example, but have you seen the video from MIT where they put the bacteria on the two sides of the table in the auger with the antibiotic, and you can watch them evolve in real time to the middle to develop antibiotic resistance? There's a Twitch streamer. His name is Pocket. I'm sorry?
They'll make an excuse then. Well, that's microevolution.
Right, exactly. And then they're forced to then make another distinction between micro and macroevolution, right? Which no evolutionist actually describes. Evolution does not describe that. That's ridiculous. It is all change, right, over time. And then, but exactly, they have to force the distinction now to make their position more. I think it's called the Mott and Bailey argument. The Mott and Bailey fallacy, where like they just keep building palisade fortifications to try to build their little castle up. It's a version of like moving the goalposts, but instead of moving the course, you just start adding layers in front. In essence, and then there's a streamer. His name is Pocket Locker, 89. Yeah, I know all this. This is what I do all day, right? Okay. Pocket Locker was featured on Gus Gibbons. She talked about it, but he was part of a biology team that did an experiment where they got unicellular organisms to develop the ability to metabolize citric acid.
Okay.
And they did not lose the ability to metabolize glucose. They gained a new ability. They gained new information. And he was on the team of scientists that did that. And he went on a debate where they essentially tried to mock him for a very long time. And he just kept saying, I was there. Guys, I was on the team that did this. Like, we did this. You're just lying about this study. I literally was there as part of the team that wrote the paper on the study. And so he does a bunch of debunking misinformation streams on his channel. Pocket Locker is... Okay. For the audience, go check him out. He's awesome.
I mean, look, as a biologist, I keep going back to there's a famous quote, Dobzhansky, I think is his name, and it's nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Yes.
Literally none of it does.
The cornerstone.
Right. Evolution explains the diversity of life. It explains the unity of life. Like it is the most all-encompassing and the most well-supported theory in all of the life sciences.
Yeah. And it's...
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, exactly. I was going to say, all it really takes is a small extension of logic, too. One of the things that I find is really disingenuous with many topics, and I like to open a lot of things with, this is actually trivial to understand if you want to. And that's my way of kind of putting the onus on my opponent right away of saying you don't want to understand this, and that's why you subscribe to this. But I begin with, this is actually very trivial to understand. All it requires is a small extension of logic. I've seen dogs produce dogs. I know that dogs come from wolves. All I want you to do is extend that back. What was the wolf's parent? And what was that animal's parent? And what was that animal's parent? All I need you to do to make this observation correct is to just think back. What would that parent have looked like? Well, here we found a fossil, right? What does a horse look like? Well, if I find a fossil of a horse that's slightly smaller, where the toes are a little more spread, and the toes are a little more spread, the toes are a little more spread, and we can line those up and you can see it happen in real time. If I can line up hominid skulls and I can ask you, you know what your parents look like, you know what their parents look like, and back. Now I just want you to imagine what did the common ancestor look like, right? I'm not saying that monkeys turn into people, right? I'm saying that people are apes. It's not that apes turned into people. People are apes because we share a common ancestor. My favorite rebuttal of that is actually Aaron Ra. He was on Jesse Lee Peterson, and he asked Jesse said, so have you ever seen an ape turn into a person? And he said, have you ever seen a bird turn into a duck?
See, one of my favorites is that people will say how can there still be, if humans came from apes,
why are there still apes?
It'd be like if you came from your grandparents.
Why do you still grandparents?
But I will tell you. So my conversion came in World Civ class, but I remember taking, is it a biogeography class? It was like an upperclassman evolution ecology class, And I remember learning about biogeography, so which is the spatial organization of organisms, and how islands in particular tend to be the home of a lot of really unique species. So why would, for example, all of these species only live on this island but nowhere else? Or why would the poles have similar environments? Why do polar bears only live up here, right? And what bear is it? There's another bear that's similar, but it's different, only down here. Or why are penguins only at the South Pole and puffins only at the North Pole? Or why do you find it's just unless you had a God that after Noah's flood purposefully sent organisms only to
very
not
specific
places that
places.
they live, but very specific places and in very specific communities of organisms, and gave them genetic codes that didn't have bottlenecks that went back 4,000 years, but went back like hundreds of millions of years. It doesn't make sense any other way except that organisms evolved where they live.
Right. Well, and you have to think about, how did they walk there? Going back to the kangaroo example, how do they walk to Australia? It's ocean locked, right?
I like the sloth example.
Oh, yeah.
How did sloths make their way from Mount Ararat to South America?
Yeah. And it's because they had to. Well, I like Australia because it's waterlocked, right? It's an island, and so for something to walk there, it must have had a bridge to walk on. So did God raise the land for them to walk? Well, that's not in the Bible. Did the Ice Age happen right after Noah's flood? That's not in the Bible. And we know that people got to different places because of the Ice Age, right? Somebody walked from China to Japan, and that's how Japan became a country. So how did whichever one of Noah's kids settled China have a whole family that created a whole society that was fine, apparently, through two massive bottleneck events that require inbreeding? But whatever, that's kind of off topic. But how does that person walk over to Japan? When does the Ice Age happen in relation to the flood? And if it does, how come ancient Sumeria, which was a country during the time of the flood, did not record an Ice Age? They didn't write that down. So you have no source that says that. And the Bible doesn't say that it happens. So you have to assume that that's there. You would have to assume that there's a land bridge that went away, or that there was an ice bridge that people could walk across, because that's how we know people got to different islands that were around. Either through getting there before the continents drifted, or because there was ice letting them go there, right? People come to North America because they can cross the strait between Russia and Africa. Or Alaska. People have to have had a way to walk there and a reason to walk there, which is where unfalsifiability comes in. At that point, you must appeal to miracles.
But right? There's also we're still talking about vertebrates. Of other invertebrates that we might talk about, and even the vertebrates that are like fish and amphibians that require fresh water. If we've got a whole earth that's flooded, then we've mixed all the world's salt waters and fresh waters. And how are the world's amphibians that require fresh water and the world's freshwater fishes, let alone all the things that are adapted to salt waters, deal with all of those waters being mixed?
Right. My other favorite kind of slam dunk is the heat problem, because it's the one the creationists themselves have admitted they can't solve.
What's that?
In order for and I am not an expert in this, but I know it from debates and things I've seen it in. Gutsa Gibbon argues this way better. She would be able to explain this way better than Erica would. Way better summary. So for the audience, go find it. Erica's channel, okay? But just to give a brief summary, radiometric decay happens, and when radiometric decay happens, it produces heat. Very, very tiny amounts of heat, okay? So we don't tend to particularly notice it in our everyday world. It happens very slowly, and it produces little bitty tiny amounts of heat. If the radiometric decay rate accelerated to allow for the amount of radiometric decay that is observed today for objects to appear as old as they are, the amount of heat that accelerated nuclear decay would have generated would have vaporized the surface of the Earth twice over. Noah wouldn't have survived the flood because all the radiometric decay necessary for the flood to happen would have vaporized the ocean and his boat. They'd all be gone. And this is a thing that a Creation Institute looked up. They tried to study it. They tried to find a solution. They came back with, we have to appeal to miracle on this. God must have done something to the heat because we have no practical answer to it. So there is no answer to the heat problem, and it basically precludes the entire conversation in the same way that the dipolar stars kind of preclude the entire flat Earth conversation. And I know I don't want to use the slam dunk fallacy that one argument include an entire argument, but there are some, for pseudoscientists, there's usually one major observation that they can't reconcile. For flat earthers, all they can say is don't look at the ceiling to describe the shape of the floor. And for creationists, they appeal to miracle. So
this is fascinating because in my experience, these are really sophisticated arguments, and they wouldn't necessarily convince the majority of people that I've come across, which is why, like in my communication, I tend to to explore why the elephant is wanting to believe what it believes.
Yeah.
Try to connect it at that level. Because I guess if I've learned anything over the last few years doing what I do, it is that the human mind's ability to convince itself of something that isn't true is honestly limitless.
It's tremendous. Yes.
I'm still absolutely shocked. Like the other day I saw, apparently we're not just drinking urine and putting it in our eyeballs and we're
vaping it now.
We're injecting it, we're inhaling it.
Mm-hmm.
Perineum sunning is pretty funny. Like of all the pseudoscience, like that's pretty great. I
can't live in this world. Why? Oh,
I actually I did a presentation on that because, again, like, who thinks that sunning your butthole is actually going to do it, right? The vast majority of people are fully aware that, like, putting your butt to the sun is probably not the best idea and wouldn't do anything super magical. But there are some people who apparently believe this really strongly. So, okay, let's explore what their claims are. let's have a good laugh over this. But obviously the goal is for you to think about your own beliefs. I'm sorry, were you prepared for this kind of stuff?
I'm really glad that I marked my channel 18 plus is what I'm saying right now. That's the thought of my... I'm thinking two things. First of all, this video is getting demonetized, which is fine. I'm not making any ad money on this. Second of all, I'm really glad that I marked my channel the way that I... No, I was not.
Middle schoolers totally get the, like...
oh, yeah.
What it is, but it's butt sunning, and,
Yeah. Absolutely. That's so funny. Oh, my God. Well, and that's crazy, right? So, like, it's funny to me, alternative health is you have a quote. What do we call alternative medicine that works? Medicine is one of my favorite quotes of all time. It was so funny. It's so interesting. Because essentially what it is it's a gigantic denial of everything that works because big pharma just wants your money. And that's super interesting to me, because if you take that conversation to any other country, right, and not to like push this particular political point in this discussion, but if you take that logic to any country that has like a nationalized health insurance or something like that, where medicine's not horrendously expensive,
every other wealthy country except the United States.
Yes. So all of them. So if you go to any country where people actually have access to regular health, what ends up happening is those medicines aren't expensive. What big pharma are you talking about? In order for this to be correct, right? In order for this to be true, all of these other countries would have to have big pharmaceutical industries, or I should say, one of these two things must be the case. Either every other developed nation in the world with a pharmaceutical industry must function like America does, or every other developed nation in the world must provide alternative medicines in lieu of medicines we have here in America. One of these two things must be the case in order for that to happen. And then people will say, well, that's a straw man argument. I'm not straw. Those are called entailments, right? The logic entails that these things are true, and that can be really difficult to differentiate, especially when someone accuses you of straw manning them. To which I usually say, well, okay, what is your reasoning for why this happens then? Don't let me straw man you. You explain it. Because to me, that's an entailment. It entails this to be true. Much like how if the earth is flat, it entails that every single nation in the world is in on it. And the more people that are in on a conspiracy, the less likely it is to be true, which is what I don't even get past. Like, the conversation is over before it begins.
Yeah, there's actually a study. I am honestly forgetting where it's from, but I can absolutely provide it to you if you'd like. It must be from 5, 8 years ago. And it was a mathematical model of conspiracy theories. And basically what it found was the bigger conspiracy would need to be to uphold it, the more likely it would be to collapse on itself.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Absolutely.
I mean, it makes absolute sense. So I suppose this might be a good point for me to bring in potential solutions.
Yeah, that sounds great.